And while I'm doing that, okay, we're good to go. Perfect. Could you share a little bit about yourself and about Cambridge Angels?
Yeah, thank you. I'm amused by how many note takers are in the room.
I
It's sort of
know.
a sign of the times, isn't it? You end up talking to a number of note takers and a handful of humans. Really nice to meet you all. This is the second time I'm doing this session. I really, really enjoyed it the first time, so I'm really looking forward to hearing your pitches. My name is Emmy. I'm the MD of Cambridge Angels, a group of 60 angel investors investing their own money in science and engineering based and healthcare based innovation. We are Cambridge, but not just Cambridge. So a lot of our deal flow and a lot of our network is in Cambridge, but we invest UK wide in early stage businesses. I say early stage, what I usually mean is the round that follows friends and family, or the round that goes along with grant funding. I think that's sometimes a little bit more of a useful way to describe it rather than pre-seed, seed, etc., because that can mean lots of different things. Check size wise, 150K up to about a million or a million and a half. It just depends how many of our angels decide to invest. That's quite an important distinction, is that it is the angels who make that decision. So we're not a fund. We don't have a big pot of money. Each angel is deciding whether they want to invest and appear individually on that cap table. Why it's important is because this is not just about money. The angels are almost all exited founders themselves. They have scaled businesses. They really get that journey and they want to deploy not just their money, but their energy, their time, and their networks. And we think that's what makes us a little bit different, is that our network is almost entirely operator led. Uh, the other thing to note about our group is that we have 6 corporate members. So those are VCs, as I believe you'll hear from VCs separately. But those members invest sometimes as early as our angels, but quite often they pick up that later stage funding. So founders, you get an early intro into 6 VCs from the time of your angel investment journey. My own background is not actually in investing at all, but I have been COO in a number of technology businesses. So I have a technology background, and I like to ask some very obvious questions. There we go. Thank you.
Perfect. So sorry, you said deep tech, health tech, and what was there another category I'm missing there?
So science and engineering based
Okay.
is usually the phrase that we use to describe it. But I think the hallmark for us is something that's got a strong level of IP. So it's something that is novel, an invention, or something that's not an iteration on what already exists.
Makes sense. I guess my first question is, so I think you're the second syndicate that we've had in now. And what's the difference from a founder's perspective on like the difference between pitching just an angel or a VC versus a syndicate, and should founders prepare any differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that the key difference between certainly a VC or a professional investing group is that they have LPs they have to answer to, and they're much more structured and checklist operating. So they will have very clear criteria. For an angel, and I include angel syndicates in that, it's very much about the relationship. So I would say it's more people led than it is metrics led. It's about making sure that they feel that you are the one to trust. So are you the person who's going to be able to make this business succeed, especially because it's in the early stages? So you don't often have the revenue, the metrics, the users, the
Yeah.
ways to validate that you are in fact going to be a successful business.
So I have a question about what you said about trust, but before that, I want to ask about like your deal flow process. How do founders find you, and what does that like what do the different stages look like?
We're very fortunate because Cambridge Angels has been around for a long time. So we've 24 years of investing in and around Cambridge. So the brand is very strong and people do tend to find us. But the best way, of course, is always through introductions. So I like it when founders are introduced by other founders, or if they've met an angel investor and that they get introduced. I don't think that, we're not foolish about that. We don't only take warm introductions, but it does help. It does help if somebody says, oh, hey, here, I'm introducing you to somebody that I know. The process wise, we review all pitch decks that come into us. Last year, we saw 1,425 pitch decks, so the volume is
Oh,
quite large. Of that, 64 companies pitched to us, so you can see that that really does narrow down quite significantly. So if you get through to pitching stage at Cambridge Angels, there is something quite special there. We like to give feedback where we can, so we're not just saying no to things. We really like to try and be helpful. We see companies pitch, at the first stage pitch. If that succeeds, if there's level of interest, then that can go through to a more formal stage of pitching, which is an in-person pitch. That has to be sponsored, though. In other words, an angel has to say, "I like this, and I'm bringing it to the group." So they would probably already have made the decision to invest.
So they do an initial pitch once they make it through the first stage. They do an initial pitch with you, or do they do it to the entire syndicate and then move to the next stage, or how does that work?
Yeah, so first stage screening is with me, but what I do is I pull in the expertise of our group. So when I said that I like to ask really obvious questions, because I am not an expert, certainly not on the life sciences side, but I am really good at asking some fundamental questions which is quite helpful sometimes. If you're not a domain expert, sometimes it's quite good to be able to ask those
Yeah.
questions. But I will pull in the expertise of our angels because we've got really, really broad and deep expertise within our group. So we'll make an assessment on whether it's something that we think is potentially interesting to the whole group. Those are the companies that get through to pitch. All of our angels are invited along to every pitch, and they self-select. They will choose which ones they want to come to based on their level of interest, which I think is good for founders because it means that you're getting people in the room who are actually potentially interested rather than a sort of curious bunch of people who are not likely to actually put up their hands at the end of it. So usually the first stage pitching, we have probably about 10 to 15 people on those calls. The later stage ones, which are sponsored, is more like 25 to 30.
Okay. And do you list the members of your syndicate on your website or LinkedIn? And the reason I ask that is I think when it comes to syndicates, one thing that can be helpful as opposed to a VC fund, where there maybe might be like 5 or 6 team members, is there's usually a lot more people in a syndicate. So there's a lot more people that there's a better chance of you being able to get um, an introduction to 60 people as opposed to 5 people.
Yeah, very true. We do. Not every single member is on our website, but a good number are. There are some people who just prefer to be a little bit more behind the
Yeah.
scenes, but most of our members are on the website. I love it when founders do some research and figure out their warm connections. The other thing that I really like is when founders ask other portfolio companies, or at least compare themselves and say, "I see the Cambridge Angels has invested in this company. My company's a little bit like that. So I think you might want." I love that level of research. I think it shows a level of diligence that is admirable.
Makes sense. And also too, it's something that only takes like 5 to 10 minutes to go through a portfolio and see where there's, potential overlap. Um, so let's say a founder is reaching out cold to you. What are the like top things that you're looking for that would make it an easy yes or an easy no?
Yeah. So there are some very basic criteria. The business must be UK based. It must be in the right funding stage. In other words, they're raising the right amount of money. But I think, every investor has a sort of a mental checklist. But I would say that there are three key things for us, and that is team, technology, traction, and in that order. So I need to know that there's a highly credible team that has the right expertise and the right pedigree in order to succeed. The technology must be something interesting. So it must be novel. You must be able to demonstrate that there's clear IP. And then traction, I don't mean revenue because I think that's, VCs will usually ask you for revenue. At the angel stage, it's a bit earlier than that. But traction means some evidence of product market fit. Do you have pilots? Do you have some customers who've said that they're interested, some letters of intent, just something to show that there is need for what you're building.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about traction is like, I mean, especially for you if you want in deep tech or health tech, where it probably takes it takes much longer to get to the point of revenue. There's always something that you can do to indicate that there's a demand in the market, even if it's as simple as like customer surveys. Like there's so many different things that you can do to attempt to validate that. And um, I guess what are in a perfect outreach email, like how long should that email be? And what are like the key links that should be included?
Yeah. I think the thing that I want to highlight more than anything else is the information in your cover note should not be something that is not in your pitch deck. So quite often, this is such a sort of a silly thing, but it makes my life really hard when founders don't include the funding ask in the pitch deck, but it's in the cover note because now I've got to have two separate bits of information that I've got to present to the angels. I know that sounds really weird, but the cover note is less important to me than what's in the pitch deck. The cover note, I quite like to see things like I mentioned, hey, I see you've invested in this company. we're a bit like that. Will you have a look at it? And the other thing is, what's a bit of a turn off, it's quite a human response, is when it's obvious that there's just a massive list of investors that are BCC'd on a single email. I
Yeah.
know that that sounds sort of a little bit perhaps egotistical, but investors like to be approached individually, just as any human likes to feel a little bit special.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think that was so important about what you said about making sure the information in the email like matches the deck. And we do investor founder speed dating events, and we'll sometimes get like 300. We get the applications and then the pitch deck. And so often information in the application isn't on the deck or contradicts it. And I think it can be as simple as you've already edited your pitch deck 20 times. It's on a PDF, so you have to change it online and re-download it. So you just include in the email that you've added, two new LOIs with X, Y, and Z. But I think it's really important
Mm.
for founders to remember that on the investor side, they're looking through so many decks, but just make it as easy as possible and make sure it's all in one place. Um, how
Yeah.
important is
Sorry, if I may, so I just want to add one other thing to that, which is a slight point of frustration. And I recently did a slightly ranty LinkedIn post about it because it kind of got a bit annoying. There seems to be a new trend of asking investors if they want to see the deck. Just send the deck. The answer is going to be yes. I want to see the deck. Of course I do. So an email, and I get why people do it because they're trying to just establish connection
yeah,
first, or perhaps they're scared of decks landing up in spam. That may be caught up in a filter, but it just adds an extra step. It's a bit of extra friction for me to have to say yes, please do send the deck. But, and you've kind of delayed the process potentially
yeah.
by a few days. So yeah, send the deck.
What do you recommend for founders in terms of follow-up? Like if someone sends you the deck and they don't hear for you for a couple days, what's the best protocol?
Yeah, there is a level of tenacity, I think, that is absolutely fine. So I wouldn't feel embarrassed about following up. I mean, on our website, we do say if you haven't heard from us in 21 days, which feels like a long time, but if you haven't heard from us in 21 days, please assume that it's a no. But we do try very hard to respond to every deck that we get. But I would give it about a week, and then I don't think there's anything wrong in saying, hi, just checking in. Have you had a chance to review the deck? Is there any more information that you need from me? I think tenacity is a good trait.
Makes sense. Speaking of founder traits, what other traits are you looking for? And like, I know you mentioned how important it is to establish trust. And actually, I'll stop there because I have a bit of a meaty question on that. And so let's just start with the founder traits. Like, what are you looking for, and how do you assess that?
Yeah, I think it's going to sound a little bit hackneyed, I think, because everybody will say this, but it really is important is coachability and the ability to listen. So our members are always saying that, oh, that founder's really coachable. We really like that. So
Mm.
they like to know that there is the ability to absorb information, learn from it, and adjust. Uh, the other thing is tenacity, as I mentioned. So they like to see that people are, not going to crumble, I suppose, at the first hurdle, because of course you are going to encounter many hurdles. Knowing whether you are the right person for the long-term future of the company is quite important. So in our world, we see a lot of scientists and engineers and technologists who are building businesses. That person isn't always the right person to be the CEO of the business. And I think that level of self-awareness comes across really well. And finally, well, I suppose the other thing to watch out for is there's a little bit of schizophrenia there because um, they want you to be coachable, but they don't want you to submit to every bit of feedback that you get because you'll get a load.
Yeah,
They want you to be tenacious, but they don't want you to be arrogant. They want to know that that you're prepared to surround yourself with the right people, but they also want to know that you're highly ambitious and that you have big ambitions for the company. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. There's a slight bit of schizophrenia there, but certainly those two things or three things: coachability, tenacity, and knowing where you're going to fit into the long-term future of the company.
that makes sense. And founders, just FYI, if you have any questions that you want to ask Emmy, um, please raise your hand and put them in the chat because we'll move to the pitch practice portion shortly. Um, In terms of trust, like I think it's difficult enough to try to establish trust with one person, but then when you're on a call with, let's say, 20 people, and maybe you're not having one-to-one conversations, how do you create trust there?
Credibility. think that's all it comes down to is the more credible you are, the more trustworthy you are, responding to questions. If you don't know the answer, don't fudge it. The investors will see through it. I think that's really my top tip is just be credible and authentic.
What I guess for health tech and deep tech, like there's probably specific degrees that you're looking for, specific backgrounds. Um, I guess outside of perhaps like the specific startups, what are other ways that founders can establish credibility?
Yeah. Serial founders are always good. So people like to know if you've done this before. If you've worked in the industry, a big name in the industry in which you're operating, so you've got that previous experience that comes across well. And failing all of that, it's about building up a credible advisory board. So quite often when I'm looking at a pitch deck, in fact, every time I'm looking at a pitch deck, I will scroll straight to the team slide. It's the very first thing I will go and look at. I look at the team slide and I go and see who's on the advisory board because I just want to see who the team has surrounded themselves with. So just making sure that you've got the right industry and commercial expertise as well as the science and engineering expertise or technology expertise.
That's interesting because we hear mixed feedback on in terms of advisors. Like I hear some investors say they don't care because you could there's not a specific, I guess, requirement that advisors have to make in order to be on the deck. Like sometimes founders will add it after like conversation with someone with an
Mm.
impressive job title. So like how do you, I guess, suss out the actual relationship there? And then my second question is like for founders who, let's say they're younger, don't have as much career experience, but there's a problem they're specifically passionate about, or they don't have domain expertise in something, but they think they have a really unique insight. Are there still ways to establish credibility with the people with those backgrounds?
Yeah, in answer to the first question, I think that the advisors that appear on the pitch deck are a signal more than, it'll come up later if you're getting down to the point of due diligence, then I think there will be a bit of pressure testing of those advisors and seeing what the full team looks like. In the beginning, I think it's just a signal. Uh, you're quite right. Sometimes people will put somebody on their pitch deck having followed just a brief conversation. I think kind of just be aware that investors do talk to each other. I had one just the other day where somebody had put one of our own members on the pitch deck, and I thought, well, that's easy. I can just ask them what they
Yeah.
think. And unfortunately, it wasn't true. He's definitely not an advisor to the company, which doesn't reflect well. So I strongly suggest not doing that. Without the domain expertise, I think there is still you can still do a lot of market research. You can go out and talk to customers. You can establish your own credibility by being very aware of the ecosystem that you operate in. Know the competitors. Don't get tripped up on an obvious competitor. Know who else is working in that industry, know the kind of top names. So just really a lot of research into the immediate community in which you're operating.
Do you look at founders' LinkedIn?
Absolutely. Every time.
I know you
As
look
soon
at
as I go and look
like
at that team, I'll go and look at LinkedIn.
are you looking at like their specific background or their posts and like their activity on LinkedIn?
No more backgrounds for me. I don't necessarily look at the posts, but I'm certainly looking at the backgrounds. And I'll also immediately go and see if I have any mutual connections. But, again, this is a people game, it's a trust game. I'm immediately going to see if we know the same people.
Sense. Got a question from Deb. Has Cambridge Angels invested in enterprise AI SaaS? Will they only invest in price round or convertibles?
Yeah, good question. Yes to the first. So enterprise SaaS, absolutely. That is our sweet spot. Uh, our angels definitely prefer priced rounds. So convertibles, it happens, but definitely a strong preference for priced rounds.
Interesting. Um, so for priced rounds, um, is there a best practice for for valuations? And I'm thinking probably outside of deep tech companies because I know those ones are slightly different. But let's say like for AI SaaS companies, is there a ballpark range you see for pre-seed and seed stage startups?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one because, of course, it's very subjective in the early stages. There aren't metrics that you can go and run a model and say, based on our revenue figures, this is what our valuation is. So it is, it comes down to, unfortunately, what investors are prepared to pay is what your valuation is going to be. Cambridge Angels, I will be completely transparent and say our group is quite valuation sensitive,
Mm.
more so than you would find perhaps in a London VC or family office, for example. So the sort of benchmark that we're looking at for an early stage investment is sub 5 million, I would say. So that's a kind of rough guide. It can vary a lot, of course. If you're in the very early stages with very little built, then it's probably more like sub 3 million. But that's an indication for us. If I'm seeing a pitch deck for a first round at 10 million, I'm probably just going to say, I'm sorry, but I don't think this is going to make it through our screening process.
I think that's a ballpark we hear in London too. Like if it's over five or over 10 for early stage, it's just not investors would expect to see a lot, I'll put it that way, in terms of traction. How much weight do you put on traction versus market potential?
Yeah, I think it's what we said earlier. So traction can be defined in lots of different ways. So I think that market potential on balance in these early stages probably takes more weight. So I think that knowing that there is a huge market and being able to articulate your TAM, SAM, SOM is really important. So to be able to um, back up and justify why you think that there is a large market. Traction wise, as I say, it's different ways to show it. Give us some pilots, show us that you've got some letters of intent, show us that you're having conversations with the right people. But I do think market size and market, bear in mind that in order to exit a company at the kind of multiples that will return handsomely to angel investors, especially if you're raising later rounds, so they're getting gradually more and more diluted. It has to be a pretty big market and a pretty handsome return in order to get something back.
My observation from seeing the behind the scenes of it, one syndicate we work closely with is that there seems to be a sort of like, I guess, magic window following that first pitch with syndicate members of a few days where if no one voices a lot of passion, things just, or passion or a lot of opinions about the founder, things just kind of fizzle out. And I also noticed that there seems to be a correlation between the questions that the founders, the number of questions that founders are getting from syndicate members on a pitch call with the follow-up conversation behind the scenes of the syndicate members. Like, is there anything that founders can do to like trigger that initial excitement?
I think you're absolutely right. That does happen. If there's not pretty rapid momentum, then it can fizzle, and that's really frustrating. And I do, my sympathy definitely lies with the founders on this because I've seen founders kind of really struggle to just get that call in.
Yeah.
Um, the key for me is identifying the one that you want. So the one that is the main expert or the one that's got the most credibility within that syndicate. Because angels, although they are incredibly wealthy, successful, you know, influential people, they're still pack animals. They're still going to follow. They're quite signal
Yeah.
led. So, that if you've got the one who is the domain expert and that person, as you say, is expressing passion or is expressing enthusiasm, the others are far more likely to follow. So, being part of Cambridge Angels, what our members like is that they've got access to these experts and they can go, oh well, oh, if Andy thinks it's good, it probably is good, or if
Yeah.
Pam says the NHS is interested, then that's probably a good signal. And so, if you're pitching to Cambridge Angels, my kind of top tip would be ask me, say hey Emmy, which is the right person here? Who's the key opinion leader here? Who's the one that I want to
Mm.
really hunt down in order to make the rest follow? That's not always going to be easy, of course, but and also I guess that don't be afraid to ask the blunt question. Just say, are you still interested in having this conversation, or has this moment passed for you? I don't think there's anything wrong with pushing a little bit to get an answer.
That makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, I'm gonna move to Cal. I'm gonna have you go f first for pitch feedback, and we'll move to pitch feedback in probably like a minute or two. So I'm going to enable screen share mode, which I always forget to do. But please get your deck all ready to go. And so yeah, my final question would be, is that like in 2020 in 2025 when investors, as you mentioned, are getting thousands of decks a year, is there anything are there any like final words of wisdom you have around standing out?
Do your research, make sure that you're targeting the specific investors that are going to be interested in your company. So don't spend your energy and your time on approaching investors that aren't going to be appropriate. Look up other companies that are like yours, find out who's invested in those companies and be very targeted. I understand the kind of need to be as broad as you can. In other words, volume, it's a pipeline game, but